Building infrastructure and running candidates helps with the third part of Grover Norquist's ongoing Islamist influence operation. Advancing the agendas of the civilization jihadists, or, at a minimum, promoting agendas that serve the Islamists' interests. Let's briefly recap what we've learned about such agendas and explore the Norquist-Alamoudi team's recent efforts to advance them. The initiatives promoted by Grover Norquist and his Islamist allies in Republican settings, in national political circles, and/or on Capitol Hill have two things in common. They are at odds with national security-minded conservatism, and they are in the interest of, and are usually vociferously championed by, the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist enemies of the United States. Let's look at each of these Norquist-sponsored or enabled initiatives in turn. Grover Norquist has worked to deny American law enforcement, Homeland Security, the military, and other authorities tools vital to countering violent jihadists. Notably, Norquist and his Islamist allies, like convicted terrorist Sami al-Arian, insist that classified information can only be used in deportation proceedings under circumstances that could compromise such data and possibly jeopardize the sources and methods by which it is obtained. The Norquist influence operation has sought to block adoption and subsequent reauthorization of the Patriot Act, a vital weapon in ferreting out and intercepting terrorist communications, financing, and plots. Norquist favors closure of the only secure facility for housing terrorist detainees outside of the United States, the American prison in Cuba known popularly as Gitmo. He's also sought to relocate the dangerous terrorists held there to the mainland, where they would be granted constitutional rights and, with help from leftist lawyers, possibly be set free by sympathetic federal judges. Grover Norquist's team has also urged that the self-professed mastermind of 9/11, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and his co-conspirators currently being held at Guantanamo Bay be brought to the United States to stand trial in civilian court rather than be prosecuted before a military tribunal at Gitmo. The risks associated with the approach favored by Norquist and his Islamist friends include real security liabilities. The direct costs associated with locking down the area in lower Manhattan where the 9/11 co-conspirators would have been held and tried under the Obama administration's plan were estimated at some $200 million per year. The associated adverse impact on economic activity in the area would be far higher. A trial in federal court in New York would also provide an unprecedented public stage and megaphone for our enemies and a potential public relations windfall for their civilization jihad. It might even endanger the continued incarceration of one or more of the world's most dangerous jihadists. For all these reasons, even non-conservatives have rejected this item on Norquist and Company's agenda. Other Islamist priorities Grover Norquist has espoused include allowing Sharia-adherent Muslims to erect what would be, in accordance with their doctrine and traditions, a triumphalist mosque and Islamic community center in a building severely damaged in the 9/11 attacks and close by Ground Zero. Norquist has expressed sympathy for the work of the George Soros-funded anti-Israel influence operation that masquerades as a mainstream Jewish organization, J Street. As we have seen, the Grover Norquist-Suhail Khan Conservative Inclusion Coalition has been a vehicle for undermining the center-right movement from within, including proposals to credential groups like the Nation of Islam and La Raza as members in good standing. In addition, Grover Norquist has championed causes that are direct threats to the security of the United States by lending a conservative legitimacy to agenda items strenuously advanced by the radical left and their Islamist allies. Norquist has immeasurably helped our enemies, both foreign and domestic. For example, as we've seen, Norquist's Americans for Tax Reform, American Conservative Defense Alliance, and other platforms have been used to try to intimidate or otherwise induce Republicans to join Democrats in gutting national security budgets and capabilities. Norquist has supported President Obama's efforts to abandon first Iraq and then Afghanistan, irrespective of the conditions on the ground or the strategic repercussions involved. Grover Norquist's Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist allies surely appreciate his determination to keep America's borders insecure. As the Iranians, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the like have established ever-growing operations in Latin America, this policy affords our enemies an array of opportunities to bring into this country with impunity personnel, weapons, and other contraband. This cartoon captures the absurdity and the fundamentally anti-conservative quality of Norquist's insistence that amnesty be granted those whose first act in coming to America was to break our laws. As we've discussed previously, in furtherance of his enabling of the Muslim Brotherhood's civilization jihad in America, Grover Norquist makes regular use of a favored technique of the left and their Islamist allies, vicious and baseless personal attacks on those who stand in their way. We'll have more to say about this practice shortly. As I am among those Norquist has slandered in this way, I can attest that such ad hominem attacks are hurtful. That's especially so since, unlike the wealth of damning facts presented in this course that document Norquist's deep and ongoing involvement over the past 14 years with Islamist influence operations, there's no factual basis for describing me and others like me who are warning about Sharia in an informed, careful, and reasoned way as racists, bigots, or Islamophobes. Unfortunately, there is abundant evidence that America confronts in Sharia a threat doctrine that is, by stealth, seeking the destruction of our country. Pointing out that reality and countering it, therefore, is not racism, and so on. Rather, it's something I've been obliged to do ever since 1976, when as a young congressional staffer, I swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Indeed, were I to do otherwise, knowing what I do, I would risk committing a felony offense under the U.S. Code. It's a crime known as misprision of treason, to be aware of seditious activity or to have reason to be aware of it and to do nothing. We've also seen how Grover Norquist has been using his contacts and organizational footprint to promote two of the Islamists' top priorities. As we discussed previously, Grover Norquist has, on at least 2 occasions, arranged presentations to mislead conservatives about legislation his Islamist clients vehemently oppose: American laws for American courts. The first, in July 2011, involved Professor Marshall Brager, who wrongly claimed that this legislation would interfere with Jews' ability to practice their faith. The second, in September 2011, featured 2 speakers from the radical left's American Civil Liberties Union, who speciously argued against ALEC on, of all things, constitutional grounds. The question is, given the great popularity of this measure in state legislatures across the country, and the threat that ALEC poses to the civilization jihadists' efforts to use our courts to legitimate Sharia, what else is Norquist doing to block its adoption? The question seems all the more warranted in light of a curious pattern with respect to ALEC that has emerged of late in 3 states where it was poised for enactment: Texas, Georgia, and Florida. Within the past year, in each of these states, top Republican political leaders intervened to prevent final votes on American laws for American courts. In each case, it was done in a non-transparent manner at the last possible moment, relying on the clock running out on the legislative session to ensure that there would be no recourse, despite strong popular approval and the demonstrable support of most legislators. Again and again, The effect was to ensure that foreign laws that violate the constitutional rights of women, children, and other Americans can continue to be applied in those states' courts, to the delight of Norquist's Islamist allies. For example, one Muslim Brotherhood front in Florida, United Voices for America, issued a press release shortly after Alec was killed in that state in March 2012. The release professed, quote, "It came down to tonight, the last hour of the last day of the 2012 session. That's where we delivered the knockout punch, killing the bill SB 1360 and their agenda of hate. Now is the time for us to strengthen our newly formed coalitions so they will think twice about messing with our communities." Unquote. At present, we don't know the full story of who was responsible in these three states for derailing at the last moment popular American Laws for American Courts legislation, or why. Since ALEC is already the law in Tennessee, Louisiana, and Arizona, and to date has not even been challenged in court, let alone struck down, citizens have a right to know precisely who was involved in scuttling ALEC in Texas, Georgia, and Florida, and why they can't fight this bill in the open and through the regular legislative process. We also need to know what Grover Norquist is doing at this juncture with respect to a second top Islamist priority: staving off intensifying pressure on the Iranian mullahocracy. While the campaign for a new American policy on Iran seems to have been inactive as a coalition after 2010, its mission is presumably more important to the likes of Ayatollah Khamenei and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad now than ever. After all, mounting evidence that Iran is within reach of realizing its nuclear weapons ambitions is prompting an escalating effort to impose more stringent U.S. and multinational sanctions, and perhaps to take military action. These circumstances would seem to place a premium on help from a skilled and reliable Islamist influence operative like Norquist, especially at a moment when the House of Representatives is in Republican hands. So what efforts are Grover Norquist and his cohort presently making to help the Iranians? This question is particularly relevant since Norquist continues, despite his status, according to 60 Minutes, as the most powerful conservative man in Washington, to make common cause with the right's most irreconcilable adversaries, namely the radical left and the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists. For example, on October 1st, 2011, Norquist departed early from a meeting of leading conservatives in San Francisco to headline a Red-Green Axis event in Dearborn, Michigan. The host city has, of course, become the locus of Islamist political supremacism in America. A visitor there recently told me that he felt transported to Beirut as he walked the streets with burqa-encased women, street and shop signs exclusively in Arabic, and calls to prayer ringing out 5 times a day. The two principal sponsors of the National Leadership Conference were the National Network for Arab American Communities and the Arab American Institute. The conference's program promoted the Red-Green Axis's current themes of Muslim victimhood, Islamophobia, the need to prevent expression that offends Muslims, how Muslims can extend their political influence, etc. Among the other headliners at this event were 2 Democratic politicians who have long been aligned with the left and Islamists in Michigan, Representatives John Conyers and John Dingell. The far-left participants in the Dearborn National Leadership Conference included speakers from the American Civil Liberties Union and the George Soros-funded Center for American Progress. And, of course, the Islamists were well represented, with remarks from, among others, an official from the Michigan franchise of the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas-linked, unindicted co-conspirator known as the Council on American Islamic Relations. Norquist's willingness not only to participate behind the scenes in events and operations of the Red-Green Axis, but to be a featured attraction at them, is highly instructive. For one thing, it shows indisputably his sympathies for and readiness to support, at least on non-tax-related issues, the work of individuals and organizations that are anathema to authentic members of the conservative movement. Second, it demonstrates dramatically that Grover Norquist has no qualms about lending his conservative political credentials and coloration to provide, as the Iranian lobby's Trita Parsi put it, quote, transpartisan legitimacy to our efforts, unquote. Third, the brazenness of his betrayal of conservative principles and values bespeaks an astonishing and profound contempt that Grover Norquist evidently feels for his fellow conservatives and what defines them as people of the right. I'll come back to this contemptuous attitude in a moment. If these suggested takeaways seem harsh, listen to a portion of Grover Norquist's remarks at the Dearborn National Leadership Conference and judge for yourself. In particular, pay close attention to his closing comment.
Right here. One second. No, I hesitated because I wasn't sure if I could tell this story without quite IDing the guy it was about. But I went to talk to a U.S. Senator leader, and I said, I have 7 projects I'm working on, and I said one of them was, would you like to meet with Muslim leaders to talk about issues of concern to the community? And he said, oh, I don't know. I don't think anybody in my town, state, is comfortable with the Nation of Islam stuff. And anyway, so, okay, next. A year later, I came back, I got 8 issues I'm working on, would you be interested in meeting with Muslim leaders? I said, oh yes, we have 70 interns at the State University, the internship's named after me, and they were visiting, and 3 of them were women in cover, and the head of our state university is an Arab American, I'd love to. All of a sudden he discovered that there were people in his state that he didn't know about.
Let's listen to that last bit again.
All of a sudden he discovered that there were people in his state that he didn't know about.
What is unmistakably captured in those last couple of seconds is Grover Norquist choking up as he recounts how the unnamed Senate leader connected with Muslims in his constituency, which brings me to the first of 2 questions that are invariably asked at some point in a briefing like this. What would motivate a guy like Norquist to do the sorts of insidious, if not actually subversive things documented in this presentation? Truth of the matter is, I don't know. The emotion you just saw may be a factor reflecting presumably his myriad family ties to Muslims. Another factor certainly could be the lucrative nature of working on behalf of the Saudis, the Iranians, others in the Gulf, Malaysia, and elsewhere in the so-called Muslim world. In addition, Muslim friends of mine who have seen Norquist in Muslim-only settings report that he behaves like a convert, even though he claims to be a, quote, boring white-bread Methodist, unquote. For me, it really doesn't matter what Norquist's motivations are. What matters is what he is doing to the conservative movement, to the Republican Party, and to the national security. We can usefully summarize what Norquist has been doing in these regards as established by the factual information presented from Part 3 through this part of our course. It comes down to this. Grover Norquist has been deeply involved in and an indispensable enabler of a classic influence operation run against the right and, through it, against our government and nation. Those familiar with the Soviet Union's intelligence tradecraft will recognize all this as a page lifted from the KGB's playbook, one that has been utilized by our enemies to advance the Muslim Brotherhood's stated goal of destroying Western civilization from within by our own hands. Let's quickly summarize what we've learned by itemizing the component parts of this operation. It started with the recruitment of Grover Norquist in the role of what the Soviets would have called an agent of influence. Giving him the benefit of the doubt, at the beginning, Norquist might have been what Lenin would have described as a useful idiot, someone who did not understand that they were being exploited by his nation's enemies. As he was confronted by me and others over the years, however, Norquist operated on behalf of the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists, knowing the company he was keeping. With Norquist's help and the founding of the Islamic Free Market Institute inside the Americans for Tax Reform infrastructure and network, it was easy to insinuate trusted Muslim Brotherhood operatives inside the conservative movement and GOP. For operatives like Khalid Safouri and Suhail Khan, this entailed creating what in the intelligence business is known as a legend, a story or narrative of conservative credentials. That entails the manufacture and promoting of helpful ties and the downplaying of unhelpful ones, such as family or other connections to the Muslim Brotherhood. The next step is to burrow in, to use friendships, connections, networking, and alliances to consolidate the influence operator's position. We've seen how Khalid Safouri, Suhail Khan, and others managed through such means to obtain positions in the George W. Bush 2000 campaign and or administration. They then used such posts to help others credential themselves, or at least gain access in ways highly useful to the influence operation. Once influence operators have established themselves as members of the targeted community, they and their enablers will strive to transform these agents into influential figures within that population, if not actually leaders of the community. A prime example, again, is Grover Norquist's engineering of leadership positions for Suhail Khan in the Islamic Free Market Institute and the American Conservative Union and the Conservative Inclusion Coalition. Finally, influence operators use their positions to promote themes and initiatives that are calculated to divide the targeted community and alienate others from it. The latter is especially toxic to a political organization or movement that must appeal to non-members to muster a governing majority. This course is replete with examples of just such sorts of behavior. To highlight again but a few of these examples, there are Grover Norquist's efforts to cut defense spending, perpetuate open borders, and aid the Iranian regime. Then we have Suhail Khan's promotion of supporters of La Raza and the Nation of Islam in his Conservative Inclusion Coalition and his interfaith dialogue operations. Another example is the collaboration between Grover Norquist and assorted Islamists to prevail upon George W. Bush to ban so-called secret evidence and to ignore the nature of Sharia in characterizing Islam monolithically and wrongly as a, quote, religion of peace, unquote. The fact that Grover Norquist has not only engaged in such behavior but done so in the company of top Muslim brothers and prominent far-left individuals and organizations is more than a betrayal of his position as a putative leader of the center-right coalition. Such behavior bespeaks a profound hostility towards the values and principles of the center-right coalition and a contempt for its members. These sentiments doubtless sustain Norquist as he aids and abets those determined to destroy the right and our country from within by our hands. I mentioned a moment ago that two questions usually occur in the course of a briefing like this. We've already discussed the first, concerning Grover Norquist's motivations. The second asks, what does Norquist have to say about all this? Well, here's a clip that exemplifies the more benign of his public responses.
So what's all this with Frank Gaffney and you and him coming after you for being associated with the Muslim Brotherhood?
It's kind of sad and silly. The American Conservative Union had a vote to condemn him for that kind of silliness just 2 days ago, actually. So it's unfortunate, but there are always people who do unfortunate and silly things sometimes.
So what about the ties to the Muslim Brotherhood?
Non-existent and silly, and that's why the resolution that the American Conservative Union passed actually referred to them as false nonsense. It's sad, and there always are unfortunate situations where people get into character assassination, but it's silly.
In other words, Grover Norquist seeks to shoot the proverbial messenger, preventing the truth from being known about him and his cohort. But how exactly does he do that? Well, first, wherever possible, Norquist tries to deflect or deny the facts without addressing them specifically. For example, in the interview conducted by the United West, he cites a vote engineered by him, Suhail Khan, and their colleagues on the board of directors of the American Conservative Union as a refutation of the damning bill of particulars presented in this course. Since few, if any, of those directors, other than Norquist's allies, had been exposed to the information you've reviewed when they were asked to approve a resolution supporting their colleagues, the vote amounts to a whitewashing of Norquist, not proof that the findings against him are false. It turns out that the vote of the American Conservative Union Board of Directors was greatly influenced by a forceful letter dated September 21, 2011, that was written by one of Norquist's friends and colleagues, board member Cleta Mitchell. On February 12, 2012, that letter, together with the board resolution, was leaked to George Soros's Think Progress, a media arm of his Center for American Progress. It's understandable why Ms. Mitchell's colleagues would have voted as they did, given the extraordinary nature of the assurances provided by such a prominent figure in Washington legal and conservative political circles. There are, however, some serious problems with Cleta Mitchell's representations that should embarrass the ACU board and discredit her lawyering in this matter. Writing under the letterhead of her law firm, Foley Lardner, LLP, Cleta Mitchell made a number of categorical representations. The sweeping character of these statements would probably surprise most attorneys, especially if they had even passing exposure to the sorts of information presented in this course, as had Ms. Mitchell. The first was her assertion that there was no basis for associating Suhail Khan with what she called, quote, extremist organizations or their activities, unquote. For good measure, she reiterated the point, claiming that I had never provided, quote, a single fact or any documentation, unquote, that would establish such ties. Ms. Mitchell actually went so far as to tell her colleagues that on the basis of her due diligence, she concluded that there are, quote, no facts to support or substantiate, unquote, the sorts of allegations I have made, allegations grounded in the myriad facts to which you have been exposed thus far in this course. Finally, Cleta Mitchell asserted that there was also no basis for my allegations against Grover Norquist, characterizing them as nothing more than, quote, character assassination, unquote. Again, she impressed upon her colleagues that she had done an exhaustive review of the material I had provided, which included the most important documentation and findings of this course, and found, quote, no basis, unquote, for what she characterizes as my, quote, attacks, unquote, on Grover Norquist. She endorses instead Norquist's narrative that reduces this matter to a vendetta against him arising from my, quote, continuing venom, unquote. In conclusion, Cleta Mitchell assured her colleagues that I had not produced any factual support for my warnings about Grover Norquist because, quote, it doesn't exist, unquote. As this course demonstrates, such sweeping assertions and assurances are not justified. Cleta Mitchell had been presented with much of the information and all the key findings with which you have now been acquainted concerning Grover Norquist and Suhail Khan's ties to Abdurrahman al-Amoudi and other Muslim Brotherhood operatives, organizations, and agendas. Other board members who relied on her claims of having done, quote, fairly extensive due diligence, unquote, were misinformed. While no secret to the ACU board on which Norquist and Khan served, Cleta Mitchell's long-standing professional and personal associations with both men were not formally disclosed. Such a disclosure might have called into question the objectivity of her assessment. Most troubling of all, Cleta Mitchell did not disclose that her law firm had been associated with one of the organizations that is among the Islamist groups with whom Suhail Khan and Grover Norquist have been closely tied, the Islamic Society of North America, the Muslim Brotherhood's largest front in this country. LaDale George, her former partner in the Foley Lardner Chicago office, was actually ISNA's legal counsel. His email address at the firm was used at the ISNA website. He was also on the board of directors of at least one other Muslim Brotherhood-linked group, Muslim Advocates. Do such relationships explain why Ms. Mitchell told her ACU colleagues that Messrs. Norquist and Kahn were not associated with any, quote, extremist groups, unquote? Given the totality of Cleta Mitchell's statements that were contradicted by evidence she had been given, and in light of her troubling non-disclosures, the ACU board should conduct an independent, professional, and rigorous review of the facts as laid out in this course, and revisit its September 2011 endorsement of Messrs. Norquist and Kahn. He would have you believe three things about the findings in this course. First, that they're the result of a personal feud. Second, that this unfounded analysis is simply a product of my racism, bigotry, and Islamophobia. And third, that I'm alone in my assessment of his activities. Let's examine each of these responses in turn. First, for my part, the alarm about Grover Norquist and his Islamist influence operation that I've been raising for the past 14 years is prompted by concerns over their implications for the national security, not the personalities involved, period. As we have seen elsewhere in this briefing, Norquist simply defaults to character assassination and ad hominem attacks, even as he accuses others of doing the same. The impetus behind such warnings is informed by an objective and reasoned analysis of the nature of Sharia and the efforts of its adherents to impose it on the rest of us, not racism or any other odious motive. As we've discussed previously, however, it is the standard operating procedure of the red-green types to try to neutralize their adversaries by employing baseless epithets. The use of such a practice by someone who is, ostensibly at least, a prominent leader of the right is indicative of the extent to which that distinction may be unwarranted and dangerous for the conservative movement and Republican Party. When Norquist's first two efforts to deflect criticism about his ties to Islamists prove unavailing, he and his friends often fall back on the line that I'm the only one making such charges. Like the other gambits, this one fails because it's simply untrue. In fact, quite a number of investigative reporters, national security authorities, and experts on Sharia and conservative leaders have addressed one or more of the aspects of Grover Norquist's efforts on behalf of Islamists and their causes, as described in this course. These include accomplished journalists at publications like The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, New Republic, and National Review. A number of highly reputable national security practitioners and experts on Sharia and the Muslim Brotherhood have also warned about the Islamist influence operation enabled by Grover Norquist. Finally, an array of influential figures in the conservative movement regard the Norquist influence operation as a threat. To date, the most prominent Republican to issue a formal warning about Grover Norquist is the highly respected 16-term Congressman Frank Wolf of Virginia, who currently serves as chairman of the House Appropriations, Commerce, Justice, and Science Subcommittee. Mr. Wolf delivered what he called a statement of conscience on the floor of the House of Representatives on October 4, 2011. Listen to excerpts of the 5-minute summary of his longer remarks that Representative Wolf delivered orally on that occasion.
My conscience has compelled me to come to the floor today to voice concerns I have with the influence Grover Norquist, the president of the American for Tax Reform, has on the political process in Washington. My issue is not with ATR's goal of keeping taxes low. Like Ronald Reagan said, and I believe, the problem is not that the people are taxed too little. The problem is the government spends too much. I want to be perfectly clear. I do not support raising taxes on the American people. My concern is with the other individuals and groups and causes with whom Mr. Norquist is associated that have nothing to do with keeping taxes low. Among them, Norquist's relationship with Jack Abramoff. Mr. Abramoff essentially laundered money through ATR, and Mr. Norquist knew it. 2, his association and representation of terrorist financier and vocal Hamas supporter Abdurrahman al-Amoudi. He also associated with terrorist financier Sami al-Arian, who pled guilty in 2006 to conspiring to provide services to Palestinian Islamic Jihad. 3, Mr. Norquist lobbying on behalf of Fannie Mae. 4th, Mr. Norquist's representation of the internet gambling industry. 5th, Mr. Norquist's advocacy of moving Guantanamo Bay detainees to the United States, including 9/11 mastermind Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Simply put, I believe Mr. Norquist is connected with or has profited from a number of unsavory people and groups out of the mainstream. I also believe that Mr. Norquist has used the ATR pledge as leverage to advance many other issues that many Americans would find inappropriate and when taken as a whole should give people pause. I raise these concerns today in the context of dealing with the future of our country.
So here's the bottom line. Grover Norquist has responded to the sort of information you've been viewing in ways that simply do not stand up to scrutiny. In fact, they only reinforce the principal message of this presentation. An influence operation like the civilization jihad that, in this case, it supports, works best when it works stealthily. It's our hope that by marshaling the facts as we have here and presenting them together with the reference materials at the Center for Security Policy's website, www.securefreedom.org, in a readily accessible way, it will no longer be possible for Grover Norquist and his Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist allies to operate in the shadows and to succeed in their efforts to destroy us from within by our hands. The necessity of exposing and shutting down Grover Norquist's Islamist influence operation takes on still greater urgency as we consider in the next parts of this course the ways in which it has enabled even more dangerous inroads to be made during and with the help of the presidency of Barack Obama. As we'll see, the effects have been devastating for U.S. security, allies, and interests abroad, and entail ominous implications for our constitutional form of government and rights here at home.